Okay, in this video we're going to cover the last part of Chapter 7, which is basically the box model. This is important to understand because after this we're going to get into the actual layouts, and without understanding the box model itself, your layout is probably not going to work out the way that you expect it to. First, you got to think about the browser and how it looks at all these different elements. If it's a container tag, or actually almost any tag, it looks like at it as if it's a little box. So just imagine that every element that you have on your page is a box. And surrounding the content of those boxes are properties that make up the box along with the content itself. Those properties would be things like padding, which is the space between the content of the box and its border. The border, that's the line that's drawn around each edge of the box. Even if you can't see it, every box has a border. The border separates the edge of one box from other surrounding boxes. And then there's the margin, and the margin separates one element or box from another. The margin basically is the distance between the border of the box and the box next to it. So we can look at a graphic here to kind of understand that, and you can see that we have a margin on top, bottom, right, left. There's a border in there. There's padding on the right, left, top, and bottom. And then inside of that, you actually have your content, which is determined by the width. Now, when we look at this margin, there's sometimes that's going to be compromised in some ways. For example, in colliding margins. This is when the bottom margin of one element touches the top margin of another element. In that case, instead of adding those two together, let's say the bottom margin of the top element was 10 pixels and the top margin of the bottom element was 20 pixels. Well, you would think that that would put 30 pixels then between them, but it doesn't. What it actually does is apply the larger of those two. So instead of being 30, it would be the 20 from the top margin of the bottom element. There's also a scenario called collapsing margins. It's when two margins actually become one. So if you had a divider tag with an H1 tag nested inside of it, to add some space between the head and the divider, you add 10 pixels to the top and bottom of the H1. Well, that margin would actually appear above the divider. So either you would have to add a small amount of padding around the divider or add a border to it to eliminate both those margins from touching each other. We're going to get into positioning in the next few weeks, and with that you'll understand this note at the bottom that the left and right horizontal margins, or margins between floating elements, and absolutely and relatively positioned elements don't collapse. So the most common of these is going to be the colliding, and this is just an example of what happens there. So you're only going to end up with one, in this case the margin top from the bottom element. So let's look at an example. In here we just have some basic stuff, H1, a paragraph tag with the class of description. Notice that we have boxes down here inside of a bold element, another paragraph here, an image, and another paragraph on the bottom with yet some more bold tags in it to show it. So in our style sheet then, all the elements are going to be given a border solid, a border width of 2 pixels, and a border color of black, along with padding of 2 pixels, and we'll talk about these in just a few moments. In addition to that, the header and all the bold tags are going to have a background color of a moderate or medium gray. So if we look at this in our browser then, you can see how the border now has been placed around every single element. This is one of the reasons why borders are not inherited. But everything has a border. Our H1 and our bold elements all have the gray background. Even the image is seen as a box, and there's a border around it as well. As I mentioned earlier, the border sits between the padding and the margin. It can be applied to all four sides or any combination of sides. You can add a border to the left about 1 EM, and that would actually make it look like a square bullet. A single border on the bottom has the same effect as a horizontal rule or an underline. The border actually has three properties that it needs. It needs to know what color it's supposed to be, how wide it's supposed to be, that's the thickness, and what style it's going to be. You can specify the border color either using a hexadecimal value, the RGB function that we talked about earlier, or any of the keywords, the keyword colors like blue or red or whatever. You can also apply them to each individual side as you see here on the bottom. You can do a border bottom color, a border right column or color, a border top color, border left color. So you can specify them individually, or you can do them all the same by just using the border color. The border style, this is the type of line that's being drawn. They're not very consistent from one browser to another. They're close, but they're not always consistent, so you might want to check it to make sure. All the different types that are available to you are solid, dotted, dash, double, groove, ridge, inset, outset, hidden, and again, just like the color, you can apply them to each individual side as well. So each side could have a different border if you wanted to, just like each side could have a different color. If we look at an example here, all we're doing is showing the different styles. You can see we have several paragraphs. Each one has a different class. Those classes then are just equating out to the different types. You can see we have solid for solid, dotted for the dotted, dash for the dash, and so on. So we'll look at this in our browser. So you can see how the different styles look, in this case in Firefox. Here they are in IE, and here they are again in Chrome. So you can see they do vary a little bit from one browser to another. Then there's the border width. This is the actual thickness of a line, just like what we talked about earlier. You can use any measurement except percentages. You can use keywords thin, medium, and thick. The actual width of the thin, medium, and thick values are not specified in any CSS recommendation as far as a pixel size would go. So the actual width that corresponds to these keywords is totally dependent on the browser itself. And again, as before with the style and the color, you could set them separately for each individual side. But you could also use a shorthand. By just using the property border, you can set all four sides any way you want. In this case, it's going to be 4 pixels in width. It's a solid line, and the color is going to be FF0000 or red in this case. The three values for color, width, and style don't have to be in any specific order. This would apply to all sides, and with that you could also use a shortcut to do the same thing for each side independently by using border top, border right, border bottom, border left, and then supplying the three values for those borders. So you can be pretty creative with borders and get things looking quite interesting actually. So let's just look at a couple examples here. In this first example, we would set the border top to 2 pixels solid black, right 2 pixels solid black, bottom 2 pixels solid black, and then the border left would be different as it would be 4 pixels solid red. Well, that required us to write 4 different lines. We could actually use a shortcut here and only write 2. Set all the sides to 2 pixels solid black, since 3 of them are that anyway, and then after that come back and reset the border left at 4 pixels solid red. This would overwrite the left that's going to be set in the border one because this comes last and it's more specific. Do the same thing by eliminating the border on the left. by doing it this way, setting everything and then just coming back again and setting the border left to none. That way the left border would not exist at all. You want to make sure when you do this though, because of the rules of specificity, that the one that's different always comes last. And usually if you are using a border, you also want to make sure that you have padding set, because without it then the actual letters are going to bump up right against the border itself and become hard to read. Both the margin and padding add space around the content. They both function very similarly, so we're going to kind of cover them both at the same time. As a matter of fact, unless you have a border or background set, you can't tell if the space between the tags is from the margin or the padding. The padding property enables you to specify how much space should appear between the content of the element and its border, so that's not touching there as I just talked about in the last slide. And the margin property controls the gap between each individual box. You can control each side of margin and padding for an element independently, just like you can everything else. Margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left, and the same goes for the padding property. You can set each one of them individually as well. The value of the padding and margin properties is most often specified in pixels. It can use any of the units of length that we've talked about, a percentage, or the keyword inherit. Padding and margins are not inherited by default, just like the border. So if the body element had a padding of 50 pixels, that does not automatically apply to all the other elements inside of it. Only if the value inherit is applied can they have the same padding as their parent elements. If a percentage is used, you have to be careful of this, because the percentage is that of the containing element or the containing box. So if it's a child box of another, it's going to be a percentage of that box. If the value of 10% is specified, there would be 5% on each side of the box as padding. There's a shortcut for margin and padding. You can set all four sides independently with a shortcut for either padding or margin. In this case, you see in the margin we have 0, 10 pixels, 10 pixels, and 20 pixels. Well, this goes from top to left just like a clock. So it would be 0 pixels on top, 10 pixels to the right, 10 pixels on the bottom, 20 pixels on the left. The same would go for the padding here. You can set all four sides at one time by just giving it one value. In this case, the margin would be 0 all the way around. You can also give it two values. This applies to padding as well. The first value then applies to the top and bottom. The second value then applies to the right and left. And then the last one that a lot of people don't talk about but is used fairly often is you can supply three values. In this case, the 0 would be the top. The 5 pixels would be both right and left margins or padding. And then the 10 pixels would be for the bottom. So let's take a look at a couple examples. In the first example, we're just going to show you two paragraphs. One's going to have padding and one's not going to have padding. You can see it on our style sheet. First of all, we're applying a border, a 2-pixel black border around both of them. So you got the group selector here with the no padding and the with padding. We're going to add a border all the way around both of them, and then we're going to come back and only add the padding of 5 pixels to the one that has the class with padding. So you can see then in our example here, the text is right up against the one with no padding, while the one below it has that 5 pixels between the words and the actual border itself, making it a bit easier to read. Okay, in this one we've got 3 paragraphs, and each of these paragraphs, as you can see, have several EMs in it. There are several of them in all 3 of these, and basically looking at the style sheet, some of the things that we're going to do, first of all, we're going to style the paragraphs with each individual margin being set and the border being set to 1 pixel solid black. You can see the size of the borders or the margin all the way around. And then all the EMs are going to have the background color set so you can actually see where that background ends. It actually goes underneath of the border, the padding, and the content, but it does not go under the margin. We'll also change the margin left to 20 pixels and the margin right to 20 pixels. Remember, even though this has been set in the paragraph tag, it is not inherited from the paragraph tag. So we actually have to add that in order to see how that works. So you can see that the EMs then have that background color on all of them in all of the paragraphs. We have added that medium gray into it. You might also notice that there's no border or padding added there. They did not inherit any of that, even though the paragraph doesn't have any padding, but the border itself was not inherited from the paragraph tag. And then you can see the spaces, the 20 pixels of space that's been added around it. The dimensions of the box itself, how do we define those dimensions? Well, we do that with the height and width properties. These enable you to set the height and width of the content of the boxes. You can take the values of a length that we've talked about, a percentage, or the keyword auto. The default value is actually auto, which means that the content box is just large enough to house its contents. The line height also plays into this. It enables you to increase the space between the lines of text. We talked about this once before, but that plays into the dimensions of the box that it's used in. The line height is the same as leading in the old typesetting, based on the fact that when people laid out text manually, they added lead spacers between the lines. You could use the maximum width or minimum width properties. These enable you to specify a maximum and minimum, so you can control what the size is going to look like in different browser windows, that you allow it to expand so far, but after that you know it's not going to look good, so you set the max width. You can look at it in a smaller browser window, but you know that after a certain width it no longer looks good there as well, and you can then set the minimum. The values of these properties can be number, length, or a percentage, and negative values are not allowed here, obviously. Same thing holds true of the minimum height and the maximum height. So look at an example here. We just have one divider. It's got quite a bit of text in it. There's no minimums here. We're going to play with this in the browser actually. But if we look at the CSS, you'll see that the minimum and maximum width has been set. It won't be any smaller than 200 pixels and won't be any larger than 500 pixels. You can see the size of it there, of how large it is. That's the max, the 500. But you can see as we change our window size, the box goes smaller as well. So it's changing to fit, but once we get to a certain point, it will no longer let us squeeze it. It won't go any smaller than that. And going out the other way, it will only get as large as the 500. Looking at basically the same example for the height, we have that set now, minimum height 150, maximum height of 200. So you can see now we're at the maximum height here. We scroll this screen up. Got a little bit smaller, but as soon as it hit that 150, what happens? It added this scroll bar on the right hand side because it's been told not to make this box any smaller. But it will allow it to expand to the maximum height. Well, overflow property. Well, why would we worry about this? Well, what happens when you set the size of something or size of a box and the content doesn't fit? What happens to it? And that's very possible to happen. A lot of times with websites these days, the content is coming from a database somewhere. So you've already, by layout, In design, you've already set the sizes for a particular box, and all of a sudden the content doesn't fit it anymore. Well, we can use the overflow property, and it has 5 values that you can use. One is hidden, which means that it just hides it and you can't see it anymore. One is visible, which allows it'll actually overflow the content box and then be on top of whatever might be below or to the right of it. You could use scroll, which automatically adds scroll bars whether they're needed or not. Or you could use auto, which only uses scroll bars when it's necessary. And then the inherit value for the overflow property inherits its overflow properties from its parent if that was set. So you can see we have 2 boxes, 2 dividers, class of 1, class of 2. They just have some text in them. First of all, on the divider, we're setting the max height 75, max width the 250, padding, margin, border being set as well so we can see this. And then on the first one, we're going to hide everything. On the second one, we're going to automatically show a scroll bar. So in our browser then, you can see that on the first one it's hidden, it's going below, and we're not seeing anything, and there's no way to see that. You can't scroll in here in any way. The second one, it automatically added scroll bars, both on the right and on the bottom, whether they were needed or not. Now in this case, we need the right one to be able to see everything, but we don't need the bottom one. If we go back in our style sheet here, and I'm going to change this from hidden to visible, and change this from scroll to auto. Make sure I save my changes. Go back to our browser and we'll refresh this page. You can now see on the top one how the overflow is visible, but it's going on top of what's below it, making it very difficult to read. You'll also notice on the second one, we didn't need that bottom scroll bar, so it's not there. But it did, because we did need it, it did add the scroll bar on the right. So those are the different ways of handling content when it doesn't fit the box that you've got it in. So now we come down to actually figuring out what size this box actually is. The setting that you give width and height only apply to the content area where the actual text is going to go, or whatever it happens to be. The actual size, or the amount of space given up by the browser for the box, is the width of the margins, borders, padding, as well as the width and height. So let's just look at an example here. Let's say we have an element style with a margin of 10 pixels all the way around. So that means right, left, top, and bottom. A border width of 5 pixels all the way around. Padding of 15 pixels all the way around. And a width of 100 pixels. Well, how wide is this box then? Well, looking at this over here, we have a right margin and a left margin at 10 pixels each, right padding and left padding at 15 pixels each, a border at 5 pixels each, plus the width of 100 pixels. So that box is actually going to take up 160 pixels in width. We could add a height here and apply this the same way in order to gather the height. The only thing that would be different, if we set a height of 200 pixels, then this would be 200 instead of 100, because we'd be using the height instead of the width. For IE6 and earlier, everybody kind of thought that they had it all wrong. Or did they? What happened with IE6 was that IE included the width of any border as well as the width of any padding in the actual size, the width of the box. So in the same example here, the padding and the border would actually be part of this 100 pixels. It wouldn't be in addition to, as we see with this, it would be included in that 100 pixels. Well, when you do that, then you end up with a height of 120 pixels as opposed to 160 pixels. Well, that makes a big difference if you've got several boxes on uh, a page and you're trying to calculate to make it fit in a 1200 wide pixel screen or whatever your default size is. That's going to make a big difference. 40 pixels a box. That's because the padding and the border again are included in this 100 pixels. So we can look at this one other way too, graphically, so you get a real vision of this. So the width of the box is this red line. For all other browsers, it would include the border and padding as well as the width element itself to get the width of the box. In IE, that padding and border are included in the width and the box becomes quite a bit smaller. Well, a lot of people took a look at the IE box model and realized that it made a little bit more sense than the standard box model that everyone else had been using all along. Translating a design that featured a box measured at 500 pixels with 20 pixels of padding meant doing a bit of math. Although the common sense width was 50 pixels, the width property would have to be set to 460 pixels to account for the padding. So that forced the web designers and the coders to have to do some math and determining what everything should be sized. Well, fortunately, with CSS 3, we now have a box sizing property. This property is supported by Internet Explorer, Opera, Chrome, and Safari. However, Firefox still supports it under its proprietary property name, which is -moz-box-sizing. So you would have to use both box sizing as well as the -moz box sizing that you see down here in your code. But basically this box sizing property allows you to define certain elements to fit in an area a certain way. You can choose between the IE model basically and the default model. In order to do that, the box sizing property has 4 values. The content box, which is basically the default value. That's the first one that we looked at, where the width and height do not include the padding and border. You could use the border box. That would be the IE model. That's going to include the border and the padding inside of the width. The initial value sets this property to its default value. That's not necessarily the same as content box. We'll talk about that in just a second. Or you could set it to inherit, where it inherits the property from its parent element. The initial keyword is used to set CSS property to its default value, but it's not quite the same as the default value of the box model. So, and this can be used on any CSS property and on any HTML element. But just to give an example here, let's say we have a text color set for a divider as red. But the H1 was set previously and we want to keep that as its initial value. So we would just set the color to initial. That's not its default value. Its default value is black, and that comes from the browser. So the initial color would be, well, what was this H1 color prior to the divider wanting to pass on the color of red? And that would be the initial value. The inherit we've seen several times. I think we've talked about this already. It's just a keyword that specifies that it should inherit its value from its parent element. Again, it can be used on any CSS property or on any HTML element. So if we set the text color for a span at the color of blue, but we have inside of that span we have another span that has the extra class applied to it, and we're saying we want to color that as the inherited value. So if these spans were inside of a paragraph tag, the extra span would actually inherit whatever the color of the paragraph would have been. So that's the box model.